Hello everyone, today I'm going to talk about how Germany opposed the inclusion of the word China in a NATO summit statement. In addition, China is taking a dual approach with Europe, being tough on one hand and soft on the other, by shortening the duration of the China-EU summit. Also, when countering Europe on medical equipment, China is still leaving some room for maneuver. China can only deal with the EU, which is like a loose pile of sand, by treating them differently, using different tactics for different people, countries, and institutions. The leaders of the EU's governing bodies, such as European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas, are still stubbornly pro-American and anti-China. But major EU countries like Germany, France, and Italy don't feel the need to follow the US too closely. Not long ago, the NATO summit that had just opened has now concluded. Observers have noticed that the brief joint statement issued at this NATO summit was unusually short compared to previous years. One notable point is that it didn't mention China at all. At last year's NATO summit in Washington, the world's largest military alliance made a big deal out of China, clearly targeting it. So people were speculating whether this year's NATO summit would do the same. Including China in the joint statement would inevitably spark intense debate. NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg, eager to please the US, naturally pushed for targeting China. But after the US imposed heavy tariffs on various countries, some nations started to wake up, realizing that Europe doesn't need to follow the US so closely or blindly join its anti-China stance. According to sources, several countries strongly opposed mentioning China in NATO's joint statement, with Germany being one of them. Germany's stance on this issue also carried over to the EU summit. Reportedly, some EU countries tried to take a tougher stance against China, but this was opposed by the Merkel government. Judging from this incident, the newly inaugurated Merkel government in Germany seems to be maintaining a certain level of caution and rationality when it comes to China-related matters. In addition, after the NATO summit, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi began his visit to Europe, traveling to Brussels in Belgium, the EU headquarters, Germany, and France. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and the EU, which is supposed to be a milestone. A summit between China and the EU will be held, and later, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and European Council President Charles Michel will visit China together. So, Wang Yi's visit to Europe also serves as a way to pave the way for European leaders' visit to China. However, on July 2nd, Wang Yi had a 4-hour discussion with EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas, and it was clear that the talks did not go well. Earlier, on June 12th, news broke that the EU was preparing its 18th round of sanctions against Russia, and the draft sanctions list included 2 small Chinese banks located on the China-Russia border, accusing them of helping Russia circumvent existing trade restrictions. If this actually happens, it would be the first time the EU has imposed such sanctions on banks from a third country, and it would be seen as a major escalation targeting China's position. China has expressed strong opposition to this, believing that the EU's actions against Russia should not involve China. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs has repeatedly emphasized that China is not a party to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. On July 3rd in Berlin, Wang Yi told German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock that most of Russia's components come from the West, not from China. He stressed that China is a stabilizing force in the world and does not participate in geopolitical disputes. During the talks between Wang Yi and Kaja Kallas, it is believed that the issue of the EU wanting to sanction Chinese companies was not resolved. Afterwards, a series of events unfolded. First, the China-EU summit was shortened. According to Bloomberg on July 3rd, citing sources familiar with the matter, at the request of the Chinese government, the second day's activities of the China-EU summit held in China will be cancelled. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and European Council President Charles Michel were originally scheduled to meet with President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Qiang in Beijing on July 24th, and then travel to Hefei on the 25th to attend a business summit. But now, the China-EU summit activities will only take place in Beijing for 1 day, and the business summit on the second day has been cancelled. This downsizing of the summit was arranged rather hastily. On the morning of July 3rd, the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China was still inviting its members via email to attend the meeting in Hefei later, but the Hefei leg of the trip was cancelled soon after, showing just how sudden this change was. It's estimated that the talks between Wang Yi and Kallas didn't go well. The Europeans wanted to talk politics, but also insisted on discussing economics. China didn't hold back either, and simply shortened the EU leaders' visit to China, cancelling the business summit on the second day. China's stance was extremely tough. Second, China announced anti-dumping duties on EU brandy. On July 4th, the Ministry of Commerce announced its final ruling, stating that EU brandy was being dumped and that anti-dumping duties would be imposed starting July 5th. However, after the announcement, more details gradually emerged, revealing that 34 EU companies met the requirements and therefore would not be subject to China's anti-dumping duties. It turns out that on the very same day, French President Macron met with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi at the Élysée Palace in Paris, and the two of them clearly discussed the issue of anti-dumping duties on brandy. Macron said that regarding the tariff exemptions announced by China, he sees it as a positive step toward resolving the dispute that threatens French exports. It turns out that major producers like Hennessy signed a minimum export price commitment with China, guaranteeing that the price of brandy exported to China would not fall below a mutually agreed level, thereby obtaining exemptions. However, brandy producers who are unwilling to make a price commitment will not receive exemptions. Third, China has taken measures regarding the procurement of medical devices imported from the EU by government agencies. Earlier, on June 20th this year, the European Commission introduced measures to restrict Chinese companies and products from participating in public procurement of medical devices in the EU, setting a threshold that bars Chinese companies from bidding on projects worth 5 million euros or more, which is about 40 million RMB. Chinese medical device companies have made rapid breakthroughs in the high-end sector, with exports to the EU reaching $900 million in 2024, a year-on-year increase of 12%. Among them, segments like endoscopes and imaging equipment have seen particularly significant growth, directly impacting the market share of European giants such as Siemens and Philips. The EU is concerned that without restrictions, China could capture at least 30% of the European high-end medical equipment market within 5 to 8 years. In response, China has adopted a reciprocal restriction measure. China's Ministry of Finance has decided to take measures in government procurement activities, excluding EU companies from participating in the procurement of medical devices with a contract value of over 45 million renminbi, though this does not apply to EU-funded enterprises operating within China. For non-EU companies participating, the proportion of medical devices they provide that are imported from the EU must also not exceed 50% of the project contract. China's countermeasures have left some room for flexibility. EU-funded enterprises operating in China are not subject to these restrictions, which essentially encourages major companies like Germany's Siemens to expand their investment in China and manufacture more medical devices. The New York Times has provided a good analysis of the predicament the EU currently finds itself in. On July 6th, the New York Times published an article stating that the EU has found itself caught in a geopolitical dilemma between China and the United States. On one hand, the EU is trying to reach a diplomatic agreement with the Trump administration to avoid being hit with high tariffs by the United States. On the other hand, the EU is dissatisfied with China's policy on the Russia-Ukraine issue and has recently restricted the procurement of Chinese medical equipment on the grounds of unfair competition. However, faced with global trade turbulence, the EU cannot avoid maintaining a relatively stable relationship with China, a global manufacturing powerhouse. According to the New York Times, it's worth noting that when the EU sets up trade barriers against Chinese products, China often responds swiftly and precisely. For example, China has launched anti-dumping investigations into EU pork and anti-subsidy investigations into the EU's abundant dairy products. Recently, China has also imposed reciprocal restrictions on EU medical devices. The New York Times says that because the Chinese and European economies are highly interdependent, the EU has very limited room to put pressure on China. China's countermeasures have made the EU realize this reality. The New York Times article points out that while the EU is dissatisfied with China, it is also imposing tariffs on the United States. As the US increases fiscal revenue to narrow its trade deficit and promotes domestic manufacturing, thereby disrupting the global trade system, the EU is becoming increasingly isolated. For months, EU officials have been stuck in a defensive position, because although the EU disagrees with both US and Chinese policies, it is simultaneously impacted by both countries and finds itself caught in the middle. The article notes that many European countries still heavily rely on China for industrial materials, and European exports to China remain substantial, especially since Germany has maintained close trade ties with China for a long time. On July 4th, Danish Foreign Minister Rasmussen also stated at a press conference that the EU's goal is not to decouple from China. The key, he said, is to interact on a more equal footing and to take a more transactional approach when dealing with issues. Felix, a European Affairs Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, offered a classic conclusion: Europe has no China card to play. To sum it up, first, the EU is fragmented and lacks unity. The European Commission is being pretentious, unable to let go of its illusions about the United States, and has even imposed restrictions on China. China shortened European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's visit to China, which can be seen as a way of sending them a warning. Second, from China's countermeasures against brandy and medical equipment, it's clear that China is still leaving some room for both Germany and France. China would rather negotiate directly with these major EU countries than waste time meeting with those naive diplomats from the European Commission. Third, the New York Times summed it up well: Europe simply has no cards to play against China. Also, in my current affairs commentary on Shiliutai, I'll talk about how Musk wants to start an American party, which will end up stealing supporters from the Republican Party. But Hu Jintao lashed out at Musk, saying he was completely out of control. Will he end up expelling Musk from the United States? Subscribers are welcome to go to Shiliutai to listen to my commentary.